July 14, 1978, Edisto Island, South Carolina. If you have never spent a summer in the Lowcountry, you have never truly felt the weight of air. On Edisto, the atmosphere isn't something you breathe, it's something you wear. It's a thick, wet shroud that smells of ancient pluff mud, that sulfuric, dark silt that holds the secrets of 1,000 tides, and the cloying, almost rotting sweetness of gardenias and wild magnolias. By 6 p.m., the sun is a bruised orange orb hanging low in the sky, turning the North Edisto River into a sheet of liquid copper. But the beauty is a lie. This is a landscape that eats light and hides blood. The island at this hour usually vibrates with a specific kind of natural violence. The cicadas scream in a rhythmic, deafening chorus that sounds like high-voltage wires rubbing together in a storm. Snowy egrets glide silently over the salt marshes, looking like ghosts against the dark green cordgrass, and the alligators move through the blackwater creeks with only their eyes breaking the surface. But on this Friday, the harmony was about to be obliterated. There was no warning, no screaming match in the general store, no dramatic standoff in the middle of the dirt road. There was only the cold, mechanical clack-clack of a Remington 1100 shotgun chambering a shell, a sound so sharp it seemed to slice through the very humidity of the air. By 6:55 p.m., 10 men from the St. James family, 3 generations of fathers, sons, and brothers, were no longer part of the living world. They lay twisted in the black mud of the riverbank, their lifeblood swirling into the rising brackish tide, turning the water a dark, bruised crimson that the Atlantic would eventually pull out to sea. These were men who had played together as boys in the dusty fields, who had shared pews in the local Baptist church, who had swapped stories over cold beers at the general store just days before. They were neighbors, bound by history, separated only by a line in the dirt. The world would later call it the Edisto Island Massacre. Investigators from the state capital would scour the island for weeks, looking for drug stashes, hidden fortunes, or deep-seated political conspiracies. They wanted to find something that made sense of the carnage, but they would find none of that. What they would find was a single weathered cedar fence post, a gray, salt-bleached stick of wood that had leaned 5 feet into a patch of mosquito-ridden swamp. For that 5-foot shift in the mud, 10 men were executed in under 40 minutes. This was a crime of dirt and blood. It was the result of a pride so ancient and so rigid that it preferred a cemetery full of neighbors to a compromise over a boundary line. Abraham White, the man who pulled the trigger, didn't see himself as a murderer. He didn't see himself as a monster. In his twisted ancestral logic, he saw himself as a surveyor of justice, a protector of the only thing a man truly owns in this world, his boundaries. Welcome to Fatal Memories. Today, we are descending into the sweltering, blood-soaked history of 1978 South Carolina. We are going to explore how a shifting fence post can lead to a madness that the Lowcountry will never forget. If you have the courage to face the darkness that hides behind the Spanish moss, subscribe and stay tuned. This is a story where the ghosts are louder than the living, and the mud never gives up what it swallows.
To understand why a man would kill his neighbor over 5 feet of swamp, you have to understand the man who stood at the center of the storm, Abraham White. By the summer of 1978, Abraham was 62 years old, but he looked like he had been petrified by the salt air and the southern sun. His skin was the color of dark cured tobacco, etched with deep furrows from decades of squinting against the blinding glare of the sun reflecting off the water. His hands were his biography, massive, calloused, and scarred, with fingernails permanently stained by the grease of a John Deere tractor and the dark, loamy earth of the island. The Whites had been on Edisto since before the Civil War. They weren't wealthy plantation owners with white columns and silk curtains. They were dirt people. They were the ones who stayed when the cotton failed and the big houses burned during Sherman's march. They had fought the swamp for every square inch of tillable soil. To Abraham, his land wasn't just property, it was a sacred trust left by ancestors who had sweated and bled for it. In the Lowcountry, your name is tied to your dirt. If you lose an acre, you lose a piece of your father. If you allow a neighbor to push a fence, you are allowing them to spit on your grandfather's grave. Abraham lived his life by an internal clock that had stopped sometime around 1890. Every morning at 4:30 a.m., he sat on his sagging, screened-in porch, the floorboards groaning under his weight like a living thing. He drank coffee blacker than the river water, brewed in an old percolator that had belonged to his mother, and smoked unfiltered Camels that filled the humid air with a thick, acrid haze. From that porch, he surveyed his kingdom. He knew every oak tree, every bend in the creek, and every shadow in the marsh. He also knew his neighbors, the St. James's family. For 40 years, the Whites and the St. James's had lived in a state of armed peace. They were mirror images of each other, hardworking, fiercely territorial, and perpetually short on cash. They shared the same struggles: the rising price of diesel, the unpredictable nature of the shrimp harvest, and the creeping influence of the modern world that threatened to turn their island into a playground for the wealthy. But beneath the surface was a jagged history of minor slights. A cow that wandered over a line in 1952, and oysterbed that was raided in 1964. Abraham kept a ledger in his head, a balance sheet of respect and disrespect that was nearing the breaking point. As the economy of 1978 began to crush the small farmer, Abraham felt his control over the world slipping. He couldn't control the banks, and he couldn't control the weather. So he tightened his grip on the only thing he had left, his boundaries. On that Tuesday morning, during his ritual perimeter walk, he reached the edge of the marsh and saw it. The cedar post. It was leaning. In his mind, it wasn't gravity or the tide that had done it. It was a provocation, a dare. And Abraham White had never backed down from a dare in his life.
The confrontation that set the massacre in motion didn't happen in the dark of night. It happened in the civilized, dusty light of Miller's Bait and Tackle. This was a wooden shack on stilts that smelled of frozen squid, old brine, and the constant metallic hum of a soda cooler. This was the island's social hub, the place where news was traded like currency and reputations were made or broken over a bag of ice. Bill St. James was there, buying ice and chewing tobacco, laughing with the shopkeeper about a redfish he'd lost the day before. Bill was younger than Abraham, sturdier, with a booming laugh that always seemed to occupy too much space in a room. When Abraham entered, the screen door slapped shut with a sound like a pistol shot. The room went cold instantly. The other men standing by the bait tanks went silent, sensing the electricity in the air. Abraham didn't buy anything. He walked straight up to Bill, his heavy work boots thudding on the worn pine floorboards. "The post moved, Bill," Abraham said. His voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, dangerous rumble, like a storm building 40 miles out over the Atlantic. Bill didn't even look up at first. He just counted out his change. "The whole world moves, Abraham. It's a swamp. Mud shifts when the rain comes. Don't go looking for ghosts where there's only tide." It shifted 5 feet onto my side. My grandfather set that cedar post in 1912. It didn't move for 60 years until your boys started dragging their nets through that channel last week. "You're trying to shave off a piece of my marsh, Bill. I won't have it." Bill finally looked up, a mocking grin spreading across his face. It was the grin of a man who thought the old ways were dead, who thought Abraham was just an old man shouting at the wind. Maybe your grandfather didn't know how to set a post, or maybe you're just getting old and seeing things that ain't there. If you want to fight over 5 feet of mud and mosquitoes, go ahead. But I got better things to do than talk to a man who's lost his mind over a stick of wood. Bill's laughter as he walked out of the store was the final blow. It wasn't just a laugh, it was an erasure. It was a public statement that Abraham White's word no longer held weight on Edisto Island. Abraham drove home in a state of icy, vibrating fury. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel of his Chevy C10. He didn't go to the sheriff. In the Lowcountry of 1978, the law was for people who lived in Charleston. For the dirt people, the law was something you enforced yourself. When he reached his farmhouse, he didn't talk to his wife, Martha. He went straight to the barn, where his eldest son, Thomas, was working. Thomas was the pride and the tragedy of the White family. He had returned from 2 tours in Vietnam in 1972, but a part of him had never left the jungle. He was a man of absolute silence and sudden, violent movements.
He moved with a predatory grace that made the other men on the island uncomfortable. "They're taking the land, Tom," Abraham told him in the shadows of the barn. "And they're laughing while they do it." Thomas didn't ask for evidence. He didn't ask for a map. He simply wiped the black grease from his hands with a rag and looked at his father with eyes that held the 1,000-yard stare. "How many of them?" Thomas asked. "All of them," Abraham replied. The war had officially come to Edisto Island.
That night, the White House was silent to the outside world, but inside, it was a war room. Abraham had summoned his nephews, Silas, Caleb, and young Abe. These were men who had been raised on the same stories of land and legacy, men who looked at Abraham as the North Star of their family. They gathered in the kitchen, away from the women and children, the only light coming from a single flickering bulb above the table. The sound of the night was the mechanical snick-snick of weapons being disassembled and cleaned. This was a ritual Thomas led. He didn't treat these like hunting rifles. He treated them like instruments of war. He checked every firing pin, every spring, every bolt. The smell of Hoppy's No. 9 gun oil filled the kitchen, a sharp chemical scent that signaled the end of diplomacy. Thomas spoke more that night than he had in months. He talked about suppression, flanking, and fields of fire. The cousins listened with wide eyes. To them, this was about a fence post. To Thomas, this was a mission. He saw the St. James family not as neighbors, but as an insurgency that had invaded their territory. The trauma of the Mekong Delta was being mapped onto the salt marshes of South Carolina, and the results were going to be catastrophic. Abraham sat at the head of the table, nursing a glass of cheap bourbon. He wasn't a man of violence by nature, but he was a man of consequences. He believed that if you let one person take 5 feet, the next person would take 10. He believed that the world was watching to see if the whites were still strong. In his mind, he wasn't planning a murder. He was planning an adjustment. "We go at sunset," Thomas whispered, laying out a hand-drawn map of the St. James boat landing. "The light will be in their eyes. They'll be tired from the day's work. They won't even see us move through the tree line." Silas, the youngest of the cousins, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He had grown up fishing with David St. James. They had shared sandwiches and secrets. "Uncle Abraham," he started, his voice trembling. "Do we really have to? All of them?" Abraham looked at him with eyes that were as cold as the Atlantic in January. "If you leave a snake in the grass, Silas, it'll bite you tomorrow. We settle this once, we settle it forever. If you haven't got the stomach for it, leave now and don't ever call yourself a white again." Silas stayed. They all stayed. By 2 a.m., the weapons were loaded. Remington 1100s for close-range suppression, a Winchester Model 70 for precision, and Thomas's prized M1 Garand. They sat in the dark, waiting for the sun to rise on the last day the St. James family would ever know. The cicadas outside continued their screaming, a sound that Abraham now heard as a battle cry. The line had been drawn. Now it would be washed in blood.
The descent into the Lowcountry. The afternoon of July 14th didn't just bring heat. It brought a heavy electrical stillness, the kind that precedes a massive coastal storm. Abraham White spent the final hours before the operation sitting in his barn, sharpening a long hunting knife he had owned since the 1940s. The repetitive shing-shing of the whetstone was the only rhythm in the silence. Around 4 p.m., the 4 men, Abraham, Thomas, Silas, and Caleb, met by the rested Chevy C10. They didn't speak. In the Lowcountry, when men are about to do something final, words become a dangerous luxury. They loaded the gear into the bed of the truck, covering the long guns with a tattered oilcloth tarp. Thomas took the wheel. He drove slowly, avoiding the main asphalt roads, sticking to the tunnel roads, narrow dirt tracks where the live oaks meet overhead, creating a dark, natural cathedral draped in Spanish moss. The dust kicked up by the tires hung in the humid air like a ghost. To any passerby, they looked like a group of men heading out for an evening hunt. In a way, they were. Thomas parked the truck nearly a mile away from the St. James boat landing, tucked deep into a thicket of palmettos. As they stepped out, the swamp greeted them with its oppressive organic stench, a mix of rotting vegetation and salt air. Thomas began to issue hand signals. This was the moment where the father stepped back and the soldier took command.
He checked the wind, noting that it was blowing toward them, which would carry the sound of their approach away from the landing. They moved in a staggered column, a military formation Thomas had used in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Every step was a calculated risk. On Edisto Island, the ground is a treacherous mix of dry sand, pine needles, and the dreaded pluff mud that can swallow a man to his waist. They avoided the dry needles that would crunch underfoot, stepping instead on the damp moss and the firm roots of the cypress trees. Abraham felt his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, rhythmic drumming that felt too fast for a man of his age. He looked at Silas, his youngest nephew. The boy was pale, his eyes darting toward every shadow, his grip on his Winchester so tight his knuckles were white. Abraham reached out and squeezed the boy's shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of comfort, it was a gesture of ownership. "Remember the line, boy," Abraham whispered, his voice barely audible over the drone of the cicadas. "They took what's ours. We're just taking it back." They reached the form-up point, a small ridge overlooking the St. James Landing. Below them, the North Edisto River shimmered in the dying light, a sheet of molten gold. They could see the St. James boats pulled up on the bank, and they could hear the distant, muffled sound of male laughter. The enemy was in sight.
From the ridge, the St. James Landing looked like a scene of domestic peace. There were 10 of them in total. Bill St. James was the center of the group, standing near a makeshift wooden table where they were sorting the day's catch of blue crabs. His 2 brothers, 3 sons, and 4 cousins were spread around the pier and the 2 Boston whalers. They were tired, their shirts soaked with sweat and salt, but they were in high spirits. They had a cooler of cold beer and a radio playing a distant country station. Thomas White adjusted the sights on his M1 Garand. To him, this wasn't a group of neighbors. It was a target-rich environment. He began to assign sectors to the others. Abraham and Silas would take the left flank, near the tall marsh grass. Caleb would stay high on the ridge to prevent anyone from running back toward the road. Thomas would take the center. "Wait for the first shot," Thomas breathed. "Then suppression fire. Don't let them get to the boats. If they get on the water, they're gone." The sun was at their backs now, a tactical advantage Thomas had insisted on. The St. James men, looking toward the tree line, would be blinded by the low orange glare. It was a perfect setup. The cicadas seemed to scream louder, a rising crescendo of noise that covered the sound of the whites racking their slides and clicking off their safeties. Abraham looked through the bead side of his Remington 1100. He focused on Bill St. James. He thought about the laughter in the bait shop. He thought about the cedar post. He thought about his grandfather's ghost watching from the shadows of the oaks. The world narrowed down to that one man, that one moment. The heat, the mosquitoes, the fear, it all vanished, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. Bill St. James reached for a beer, his back turned to the woods. He was saying something to his eldest son, a joke that made the boy laugh. In that split second, Thomas White squeezed the trigger of his Garand. The .306 round traveled the distance in a fraction of a heartbeat, striking Bill in the upper back. The force of the impact didn't just knock him down, it threw him forward onto the wooden table, scattering blue crabs and ice across the mud. The silence that followed was terrifying. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, the time it took for the St. James family to realize that the sound they had heard wasn't a car backfiring, but a declaration of war. Then the ridge erupted in fire.
Chaos is the only word for what followed. The St. James men were trapped in a natural cul-de-sac. To their front was a wall of fire coming from the woods. To their back was the deep, unforgiving current of the North Edisto River. They had no weapons, only oars, fishing knives, and heavy wooden crates. Thomas White moved out from the tree line, firing as he walked. He wasn't rushing, he was advancing with the steady, rhythmic gait of a professional. Crack, crack, crack. Every shot from the Garand found a mark. One of Bill's brothers tried to dive into the river, but a slug from Silas's Winchester caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around in the mud. Abraham felt a strange, detached sensation as he emptied his Remington. The recoil was a familiar kick against his shoulder, a physical reminder of his power. He saw David St. James, a boy who had once mowed his lawn, trying to hide behind a rusted fuel drum. Abraham didn't hesitate. He chambered a slug and fired. The fuel drum didn't explode, but the round punched through the thin metal and the boy behind it. "They're running!" Caleb shouted from the ridge, his shotgun roaring. 2 of the St. James cousins had managed to scramble into the tall cordgrass of the marsh. In the Lowcountry, this grass is razor sharp, and the mud beneath it is like quicksand. They were trying to reach a small drainage pipe that led under the road. Thomas signaled to Silas and Caleb to flush them out. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and the iron-sweet scent of blood. The St. James family, once a proud and boisterous clan, was being systematically dismantled. There was no room for mercy in Abraham's heart. Every time he saw a St. James face, he saw the theft of his land. He saw the 5 feet of mud that Bill had stolen. The most brutal part of the massacre happened near the pier. 3 of the younger St. James boys had huddled under the wooden structure, thinking the thick pilings would protect them. Thomas walked to the edge of the pier and looked down. He didn't say a word. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a fresh clip, and reloaded his Garand. The metallic ping of the empty clip hitting the wood was the last sound those boys ever heard. By 6:50 p.m., the shouting had stopped. The only sounds were the crackling of the country music radio, which was still playing on the table, and the soft, wet sound of the tide coming in. 10 men lay still. The North Edisto River was beginning to wash over the bodies, the salt water stinging wounds that no longer felt pain.
The whites stood in the clearing, 4 ghosts among the dead. The adrenaline that had fueled them was beginning to evaporate, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. Abraham's ears were ringing, a high-pitched whistle that made the world feel distant. He walked slowly toward the cedar post, the object that had birthed this nightmare. It was a simple, gray stick of wood, salt-blasted and ancient. Abraham stood over it, his shotgun hanging from his hand. He looked at the post, then he looked at the bodies of his neighbors. He felt a sudden, desperate need to justify what he had done. He needed to see the proof of Bill's theft. He gripped the post with his calloused hand. He expected it to be firm, a permanent marker of the stolen boundary. But the moment he applied pressure, the post gave way. It didn't just lean, it slid out of the mud with a wet, sucking sound. Abraham stared at the base of the post. It was rotten. The salt water and time had eaten away at the cedar until it was nothing but a hollow shell. He looked at the bank of the creek. The heavy rains from the previous week had caused a minor landslide, a natural shift in the silt. The post hadn't been moved by Bill St. James. It had been moved by the hand of God, or the hand of the river. It was an accident of nature. Abraham fell to his knees in the pluff mud. The weight of the realization was more crushing than any prison sentence. 10 men, his friends, his neighbors, his church brothers, were dead because he couldn't distinguish between a theft and a tide. He had destroyed 2 families for a piece of rotten wood. "Pa?" Thomas asked, stepping toward him. His face was still blank, but his eyes were searching his father's. Abraham didn't answer. He looked at his hands. They were covered in mud and the blood of men he had known for 60 years. The golden hour was over. The sun had set, and the shadows of the oaks were growing long, reaching out like fingers to claim what was left of the White family. "We have to go," Thomas said, his voice regaining its military edge. "We go back to the farm. We clean the guns. We wait." Abraham allowed his son to pull him up. He walked back toward the truck, leaving the post lying in the mud. He didn't look back at the St. James landing. He didn't need to. He knew that from this moment on, he would never see anything else but those 10 bodies and that rotten stick of wood. The Edisto Island massacre was over, but the haunting had just begun. The descent into the Lowcountry. The afternoon of July 14th didn't just bring heat, it brought a heavy electrical stillness, the kind that precedes a massive coastal storm. Abraham White spent the final hours before the operation sitting in his barn, sharpening a long hunting knife he had owned since the 1940s. The repetitive shing-shing of the whetstone was the only rhythm in the silence. Around 4 p.m., the 4 men, Abraham, Thomas, Silas, and Caleb, met by the rusted Chevy C10. They didn't speak. In the Lowcountry, when men are about to do something final, words become a dangerous luxury. The drive back to the White farm was a journey through a world that no longer belonged to them. Inside the Chevy C10, the smell was a suffocating mix of burnt cordite, sweat, and the iron-rich tang of blood that had splattered on Thomas's fatigues. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the gravel crunching under the tires and the rhythmic slapping of a loose fan belt. Abraham sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the horizon. He wasn't seeing the road. He was seeing the way Bill St. James's body had slumped over that sorting table. When they arrived, the farmhouse looked disturbingly normal,
Martha White was in the kitchen, the soft yellow light from the window spilling out onto the porch. She was preparing supper, fried chicken and collard greens. The normalcy of it was the cruelest part. Abraham walked into the house, his boots leaving dark, wet smears of pluff mud on the clean linoleum floor. Martha looked up, her smile fading as she saw the hollowed-out look in her husband's eyes. She didn't ask what happened. In the Lowcountry, women of her generation knew that silence was the only way to survive certain truths. Thomas, ever the soldier, took the weapons to the cellar. He didn't hide them, he cleaned them. The mechanical clink of the M1 Garand being stripped down echoed through the floorboards. He was erasing the evidence of the fire, but he couldn't erase the heat. Silas, the youngest, didn't make it past the porch. He slumped into a rocking chair and began to weep, not loud, but a steady, shaking vibration of the soul. He was 19 years old, and he had just executed his best friend over a piece of rotten cedar. Abraham finally sat at the kitchen table. He didn't eat. He just stared at his hands. They were the hands of a farmer, a provider, a man of God. Now they were the hands of a butcher. At 8:45 p.m., the first blue lights appeared at the end of the long dirt driveway. Abraham didn't move. He didn't tell his sons to run. He knew that on an island there is nowhere to hide from yourself. When Sheriff Boudreaux stepped onto the porch, Abraham simply said, "The guns are in the cellar, Leonard. Don't wake the girls."
The trial in the winter of 1979 was held in a courtroom that felt more like a funeral parlor. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, floor wax, and the heavy wool coats of the onlookers. Abraham White sat at the defense table, looking smaller than he ever had. The petrified oak of his character had begun to crumble. Across the aisle sat the survivors, the widows and daughters of the St. James family. Their silence was a physical weight in the room, a collective accusation that no lawyer could argue away. The prosecution focused on the premeditation. They brought in the whetstone Abraham had used. They brought in the hand-drawn maps Thomas had made. They painted a picture of a cold-blooded military operation. But the defense tried to evoke the dirt code. They talked about the pressure of the harvest, the sanctity of boundaries, and the ancient laws of the Lowcountry that existed long before Charleston had a courthouse. They tried to make the jury, city people from Columbia, understand that for a man like Abraham, land wasn't an asset, it was his lifeblood. But the turning point was the testimony of the state surveyor. He stood at the witness stand with a clinical, detached air and presented a series of topographical maps. He explained in cold scientific terms how the heavy rainfall of early July had liquefied the silt layers, causing a localized subsidence of the creek bank. He proved that the Cedar Coast had moved due to gravity and erosion, not human interference. When that testimony was delivered, a low groan escaped Abraham's throat. It was the sound of a man realizing he had sacrificed his soul for a ghost. The jury didn't take long. 10 counts of first-degree murder. When the judge read the sentence, life without the possibility of parole, Abraham didn't flinch. He looked over at Marie St. James, Bill's widow, and for the first and only time, he bowed his head. It wasn't an apology, it was a recognition. 2 families were now extinct, one by lead and one by law.
Abraham White spent his final years in the South Carolina Central Correctional Institution. For a man who had lived his entire life in the wide open spaces of the marsh, the 6 by 9 foot cell was a special kind of hell. He was a model prisoner, but not because of a change of heart. He was simply waiting to die. He refused to speak to the prison chaplains, and he rarely spoke to his fellow inmates. He became a ghost within the walls. His son Thomas lasted only 3 years. The Vietnam ghost that had driven him to lead the massacre finally demanded its final payment. Thomas was found in his cell, having carved a map of Edisto Island into his own arm before taking his life. The trauma of the war and the trauma of the island had merged into a singular, unbearable nightmare. Abraham received the news in the prison yard. He didn't cry. He simply went back to his work in the prison garden, his fingers digging into the red clay of the Midlands, a soil that felt wrong, too dry, too hard, not like the soft black silt of home. In 1984, Abraham's heart finally gave out. In his final hours, he reportedly became delusional. The nurses said he kept talking about the tide coming in and asking if someone had checked the eastern fence line.
He wasn't in a hospital bed in Colombia. He was back on his porch on Edisto, waiting for a sunrise that would never be stained with blood. He died at 3:15 a.m., the exact hour he used to wake up to start his farm work. He was buried in a potter's field, his grave marked only by a number. The man who killed for a boundary ended up in a plot of land that didn't even bear his name. Today, if you drive down to Edisto Island, you won't find any signs pointing to the White Farm or the St. James Landing. The community did what the Lowcountry does best. It let the swamp swallow the memory. The White farmhouse was eventually sold and torn down to make room for a luxury eco-resort. The barn where Thomas cleaned his garand is gone, replaced by a tennis court. People from out of state sip cocktails under the same live oaks where Abraham once plotted a massacre, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet once drank the blood of 10 men. But the island remembers in its own way. The locals, the few who remain from the old families, still avoid the eastern bend of the creek. They say the fish don't bite there and the birds don't sing. The Spanish moss hangs a little lower, a little thicker, over the spot where the cedar post once stood. It's a place of permanent shadow, where the humidity feels even heavier than the rest of the island. The story of the Edisto Island bloodbath isn't just a tale of a crime. It's a cautionary tale about the gravity of pride. It's a reminder that when we refuse to see our neighbors as humans and instead see them as obstacles to our honor, we have already lost. Abraham White thought he was a protector, but he was a destroyer. He thought he was drawing a line in the vert, but he was drawing a line through his own soul. As we look back at 1978, we have to ask ourselves, what are our fence posts? What are the small, insignificant things we are willing to kill for? Whether it's an insult on the internet, a slight in traffic, or a dispute over a boundary, the ghost of Abraham White is always there, whispering that honor is worth more than mercy. Thank you for watching this 12-part descent into the dark heart of South Carolina. If this story moved you, if it chilled you, or if it made you rethink the cost of your own pride, please leave a comment. Subscribe to Fatal Memories as we continue to unearth the stories the world tried to bury. Until next time, watch your boundaries, but never forget the humanity on the other side of the fence. The moss is watching, and the tide is always coming in.